accidentally Earth Day. So it's a good way to celebrate. My name is Tarki Heath, and I'm the current president of the Cortland Onondaga Federation of Kettle Lake Associations, which is much easier when you just say COFOCLA. And we are the sponsors for tonight's event. COFOCLA, if you don't know, and I'll just do this briefly, is a coalition of kettle lakes in Cortland and Onondaga counties that fall on the edge of the Finger Lakes region. And right now we consist of Song Lake, Tully Lake, Crooked Lake, and Little York Lake. Our mission predominantly is outreach and education. And so at the beginning of our meetings, we have presenters come in and talk about issues that are important to our watershed regions. They don't have to be directly related to water quality issues, but they can be anything that happens within the watershed, which is just about everything. They are all of our meetings are open to the public because we all live in a watershed, and so we want to have that information out for all to share. If you want to keep up with our activities, we do have a website at www.cofocla.org. It has a list of the presentations that we will have throughout the year, this coming year. It also has a list of our past presenters, and some of those you can actually download and view, or you could get the transcript. There's some very interesting information on the site, so I encourage you to go there.
Good evening, everyone. I too want to thank everybody for coming. And it's a very fortuitous circumstance that we're doing this on Earth Day. And tonight, I promise you, you're going to learn a lot. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to introduce my friend, Professor Tony Ingraffea from Cornell. His specialty is fracture mechanics. And I'm not smart enough to know what that is, but you'll know by the time Tony gets done today. I have heard Tony speak a number of times over the last 3 or 4 years, and every time I learn something new. And when it comes to fracking, a lot of us have heard a lot of noise about it from either side. But what you'll hear tonight are facts. Most of what Tony uses comes directly from the industry. And so what you'll hear tonight are what our communities can learn about the dangers of high-volume, slick-water, horizontal, hydraulic fracturing. And that's the entire process, not just the moment that the rock is cracked by the high pressure they use, but from the beginning to the end of the process, which is something that's often lost when you hear the industry speak about this. And this process creates a lot of dangers for our water, our farms, people, wildlife, and air. And so tonight we'll hear some of the myths and then the realities of unconventional gas drilling and its large-scale industrial development. You'll learn that it's a complex engineering process, and you'll learn why wells leak. Not if wells leak, but why they leak. And you also will learn about the geology of the shale and the many pathways that are inherent in its geological formation that allow for migration of chemicals and methane. And on a global scale, we'll hear some about how we have to stop thinking that we can keep using fossil fuels without any consideration for what it's going to do to our children and our grandchildren. The problems of climate change are directly linked to our consumption of fossil fuels, and the idea that at this stage in history we have people advocating that we should switch from one fossil fuel to another rather than work for true sustainability without polluting the atmosphere more is something that we really should begin to move away from. So I just want to read some of Tony's accomplishments. He's the Weiss, he's the David C. Baum Professor of Engineering at Cornell and the Weiss Presidential Teaching Fellow at Cornell. He's done research and development at Cornell for the oil and gas industry for 25 years, specializing in hydraulic fracturing, simulation, and pipeline safety, another area we don't hear enough about. He's twice won the National Research Council U.S. Nation Committee for Rock Mechanics Award for research in rock mechanics. He became the co-editor-in-chief of Engineering Fracturing Mechanics in 2005. He won the George Irwin Medal for Outstanding Research for Fracture Mechanics in 2006. He's been named a fellow to the International Congress on Fracture. And recently, he's been deeply engaged in public speaking and to educate citizens and governmental officials about fracking in what must be hundreds or more speaking presentations. He's also the president and founding member of the Physicians, Scientists, and Engineers for a Healthy Energy. And finally, in 2001, Time magazine named him as one of its people who matter. So we are really fortunate tonight to have Professor Ingraffea. Tony.
Before I get started, some ground rules. That's where I usually start a class at Cornell. There's some things that we need to get clear with each other. I'm here to try to inform you, educate you, excite you, entice you to other learning on this very complex topic. But there are two things I need to make clear. And they're both related to the fact that I'm a licensed professional engineer in the state of New York. And as such, I have to swear an oath of ethics. And I've highlighted for you the first three issues in that ethics oath, one of which is to hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. So as a licensed professional engineer in the state of New York, I have an obligation, an ethical obligation, if I'm going to stand before the public and talk to you about something having to do with engineering, I have to make sure that the first thing I make sure of is not that I make any money on it, or that you make any money on it, but that collectively we hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. I swear that I will only perform services in areas of my competence. Tonight I'm offering a service. It's a public outreach service, which is part of my job description at Cornell University. We're a land-grant university. Every faculty member at Cornell has an obligation to engage in public outreach. You're the public, I'm reaching out. And third, I issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner. So I've been doing this, as Joe said, for about 4 years. I've done literally hundreds of presentations like this in different places, different times. It seems like I've been in every high school and middle school auditorium in upstate New York, every church basement, disused movie theaters. It's been fun. But, two things. If at any time I say something tonight that you think I am not qualified to talk about, don't wait. If you think I'm going outside my area of competence or experience and saying something that you don't think I have the background, judgment, and experience to say, don't wait. Second thing, if at any time tonight I say something that you think is misinformation, inaccurate information, incorrect interpretation, or an outright lie, stop me. So I've had the courage over the last 4 years to stand in front of hundreds of audiences like this, and it does take a little bit of courage. It might look to you like I'm having a good time up here right now. I'm sweating. But I've been criticized, for example, for being too old. Hey, 66 is the new 65. I've been criticized for being over the hill and retired. Gee, I wish I was. I've been told that I'm too short. That one's right. Unfortunately, people who come here to these talks who don't agree with what I have to say sometimes aren't courageous enough to tell me that. They wait until they're home and then they call somebody in the industry and they say, get on your blog and denigrate Professor Ingraffea. I don't like that. My wife doesn't like it. She likes me. So if there's anything I say tonight or anything I do tonight that you think is untoward, unprofessional, inaccurate, tell me now. Have the courage to stand up and say, I disagree. And we'll have a discussion. We'll have a civil discussion, and we'll reach a resolution. That's the only thing I ask, that you be curious, that you be civil with me, and that at any time you want to engage in debate, let's do it. Let's get it on. Let's not wait for somebody else to do it for you on some blog site. Other than that, let's get going. So I'm going to divide my interaction with you tonight into 4 major topics. I understand that many of you have heard presentations before, and you pretty much understand what it takes to get natural gas out of a shale formation. But some of you don't. So let's get all on the same wavelength and get to the same level of understanding. How does the whole process work? Not just fracking, but as Joe said, the whole process. From the time that they have to mine sand in Wisconsin and ship it by rail to upstate New York, to the time that the gas goes to the burner tip in your home. That's the whole process. And I'm prepared to talk about all aspects of that whole process tonight. Then we'll shift to the second question, is there a significant industrial impact? How will the area around Tully change? It's obviously not industrialized at this point. Will it become industrialized necessarily by the nature of the geology of shale? Third, how often do gas wells leak? What's the probability that a gas well in my neighborhood will contaminate a sole source aquifer from which I'm drawing my drinking water? And finally, is shale gas a clean fossil fuel? Those are the 4 topics. Hopefully we'll get through all of them before midnight. But I'll slow down as necessary if questions arise. If there's a really detailed question that we can hold to the end, I'll suggest that we do that. But if it's a question of clarification, and as I said before, if you think I'm saying something wrong, let me know. So let's get going. How does the whole process work? I'm going to use a set of graphs, figures, videos, and photographs to try to describe to you what I call Shale Gas Development 101. There have been a lot of gas and oil wells drilled in New York State. 40,000 of them, at least. Not one has been of the type I'm about to describe. Not one. All the ones that exist started off with the development of an area on the surface called a pad, PAD. That's where the drilling occurs from. The drill rig comes in, drills a well more or less straight down, but not into shale, into another rock that is harboring a large volume of natural gas in a single place. That's not what's shown here. So you have to imagine that there's a big pool, a bubble of natural gas down here, not in shale. And if a well was drilled more or less vertically into that big bubble, you strike it rich. If you don't, you have a dry hole. 50% of the time in New York, drilling resulted in dry holes. Poked a hole in the ground, didn't hit any gas, went someplace else and tried again. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is what this picture shows. Here is a layer of shale. As you know, shale is a sedimentary rock. It occurs in layers, relatively thin layers. Relative to what? Well, you have to drill down, say, 5,000 feet, 10,000 feet, depending upon where you are. We wouldn't be drilling for the Marcellus under here because it's too shallow, but we might be going for shale gas and shale layers below the Marcellus. So we might have to drill down 5,000 feet, and we find out that the shale layer that we're targeting for production is only about 100 feet thick. 50 feet, 100 feet, 150 feet, but it's not thousands of feet thick. That's bad. On the other hand, the shale layer goes on for hundreds of miles. There's a shale layer down below the Marcellus here that starts off north of Lake Ontario and goes all the way down to Virginia. That's a lot of shale. And there's gas in it almost everywhere. Except that gas is not accumulated into big bubbles. It's distributed throughout the shale. So this is a process called unconventional gas development from shale formations, which has never occurred in New York State. And it's called unconventional for 4 reasons. One, you can't just drill straight into it, because if you do, your well would only intersect the shale over the thickness of the shale. And since the gas is everywhere in the shale, you'd only get the gas over a very short interval. The well would be uneconomic. Gas company wouldn't do it. Not worth the money. See this 5,000 feet? That's $5 million. $1 million per 1,000 feet. Rule of thumb for drilling a shale gas well. So you don't want to waste $5 million drilling a hole that only gets in contact with shale for 100 feet or so. Rather, you use one of the new technologies called directional drilling, so that you drill down and then drill not into the shale, but along the shale in something called a lateral. Sometimes called a horizontal, but it's not necessarily horizontal, it's just lateral. And in a modern shale gas well, like the ones being drilled in Pennsylvania right now, that lateral is usually longer than the vertical. So you can drill down a mile and then drill out 2 miles. Why? Well, the gas is everywhere in the shale. The more contact you have between the well and the shale, the more likely it is you're going to get a lot more gas out. You got that, right? But that's not good enough. Now that you've got a well that's thousands of feet along the shale, I'm going to switch pictures on you here. Let's go underground. Ready? Down we go. Except we're not really going to go down. We're going to remove about 1,000 feet of overburden and walk up the Taganek Gorge. How many people here have walked up the Taganek Gorge? There. So you've walked up the trail over here. Here's the bridge. The falls is up here. And if you walked up the gorge, you've been looking at an exposure of shale, black shale. There it is. There's Taganek Creek. See this red lateral? Let's use our imaginations. Let's superimpose that red lateral through that shale. What's the most prominent feature that you see in this photograph of this shale? What's the most prominent feature?
Cracks.
It's already cracked. These are called joints by geologists. Those are natural cracks. They weren't sawn in. Nature put them there. They got there because they are natural hydraulic fractures. Natural hydraulic fractures. Misnomer, hydraulic doesn't mean water. Sounds like hydraulic must mean water, right? No. Hydraulic fracture is a fracture caused by fluid. Gas is a fluid. So sometime in the last 350 million years, the gas pressure in that shale got so high that it naturally fractured the shale using a process called hydraulic fracturing. Aha. So there must be a lot of gas stored in those natural fractures because they were created by gas pressure. Okay. Well, how do we get the gas out of those natural fractures? We connect them to this red steel pipe called the lateral, also called the production casing. It's a steel pipe on the order of 4 to 5 inches in diameter. It's on the order of 2 miles long. It's solid steel, and the gas is stored in that fracture once you want it to get into that steel pipe. So now we get into the hydraulic fracturing process. First there was the pad, then there was the vertical drilling, then there was the lateral drilling, then there was the insertion of the casing, then there was cementing. We skipped a lot of that. But now we got a problem here. We have all this gas that's stored in these natural fractures, and we want to get that gas out of those natural fractures inside that steel pipe so it goes up to the surface. Next step, punch holes in the steel pipe. Process called perforation. Right? Paper punch, perforate the paper. So we set off thousands and thousands of small explosive charges that blow holes through that steel pipe, through the cement that surrounds it, and into the rock. And now we have possible pathways for the gas, which is stored in those natural fractures, to find its way along those natural fractures, through those perforations, into the steel pipe and up to the surface. And if that's all you did, you'd get some gas. But not very much. Because the gas that's stored in those fractures is stored in fractures that are only millionths of an inch wide. They're being squeezed together by natural earth pressure. Those natural fractures are being squeezed together. So we want to overcome that squeezing pressure, and we do that by hydraulic fracturing, except that it's not hydraulic fracturing, it's hydraulic refracturing. There are already hydraulic fractures. We just want to reopen them, open them wider, and keep them open against the earth pressure? Well, we've already done everything we need except to pump a fluid called frac fluid down that production casing, out through those perforations, into these natural fractures, reopen those natural fractures wider, as in like 1/10 of an inch, as far as we can, hundreds of feet in this direction, hundreds of feet in that direction, hundreds of feet up, hundreds of feet down. We want to prop open those natural fractures and keep them open, and to do that we will inject a proppant, typically silica sand. Well, what's the diameter of a silica sand particle? Oh, 1/10 of a millimeter, 1/10 of an inch, whatever, 100,000th of an inch, whatever the particles are. You shove those particles into those reopened natural fractures, and when you relieve the pressure of the hydraulic fracturing fluid, those fractures want to shut back up again under earth pressure, except they can't because they're now propped open with sand particles. Now we've hydraulically fractured the well, and we've created flow paths. All the gas that's stored in these natural fractures can flow back along propped open natural fractures through the perforations, up the production casing, all the way to the surface, and eventually to the burner tip in your house. Shale gas development 101. All those technologies had to come together, but we haven't done yet. There's two more. Directional drilling, high volume frac fluid. Higher than what? Current regulations in the state of New York limit fracking to 80,000 gallons per well. There was a proposal to increase it to 300,000. Our regulations are now defunct. We have to start over again. So what we have in the books right now is if you're going to frack a well, 80,000 gallons. There have been thousands of wells already fracked in New York State, not shale gas wells, traditional wells, and each one of those wells never used more than 80,000 gallons of frac fluid. But for shale, since this is going to be a mile or two long, and each one of these fractures, it's natural, is only about a foot away from every other one, we're going to want to open literally thousands of those natural fractures. That takes a lot of fluid, about 100 times more fluid. Anywhere between 5 and the record right now is 42 million gallons for a single flat frac job on a single well. Average in New York, in Pennsylvania right now is about 5 to 6 million gallons. So we have to inject much higher volumes of fluid in order to do what I just described. With me so far? Engineers are proud to solve problems. And every time an engineer solves a problem, he or she creates the next one. So now we have this problem. We want to inject 5 million gallons of frac fluid, 3 miles, through a pipe that's 4 to 5 inches in diameter, at 10,000 pounds per square inch in about an hour. Get out your pencil and paper, run the calculations. How many horsepower does it take at the surface to pump 5 million gallons of fluid 3 miles through a 4-inch diameter pipe at 10,000 pounds per square inch in an hour?
A lot.
Anybody did that calculation? Come on. Come on, you're upstate New Yorkers.
15,000.
The answer is infinite. There's not enough horsepower in the world to do that because of frictional dissipation. Water isn't slippery enough. You pump water through a pipe like a hose in your backyard. You ever notice the longer your hose gets, the less the pressure is at the other end when you turn the faucet on? It's because of friction between the water and the hose. Same thing here. So to make this work, somebody had to invent slick water, slippery water, put a lubricant in the water so that you can actually do that process with a finite amount of horsepower, finite meaning on the order of 40 to 50,000 horsepower. We've never had a well drilled in New York with 40 or 50,000 horsepower. I'll show you a picture of what that looks like in a minute. Okay, so there's three technologies: directional drilling, high frac fluid volumes, slick water. We need one more to make the whole thing economical, and this is the technology that most people don't understand. It's frustrating for me. I've done this a couple hundred times all over New York and Pennsylvania, done in foreign countries, and the single thing that people don't get is the thing I'm going to talk about next. I'll use a fancy phrase for it, then I'll show you pictures. Spatial intensity. Sounds marshy. What's spatial intensity? Okay, other pictures. Let's use 3D stereo. Everybody here has been to a movie theater, put the glasses on, right? You see the stereo movie? Everything seems like it's coming out of the screen at you. So these two engineers are literally in a movie theater, and they are actually in the Marcellus Formation. Here's the surface of Tioga County, Pennsylvania. Here is the lithology of the rock above the Marcellus. Here's the Marcellus. Here are vertical portions of wells. Here are lateral portions of wells. Here's the fracked area. And these guys are talking about how to make it work. What's spatial intensity? And why is it absolutely crucial for the economic viability of shale gas development? Another 3D stereo picture. This one's easier to explain, I hope. Here's a topographic map of a portion of Tioga County, Pennsylvania. Here is what the Marcellus shale looks like under that portion of Tioga County. Well, how the hell do they know what Marcellus shale looks like 6,000 feet underground? Can't get down there and take a picture of it. How do they do that? Thump, thump, thump. Anybody seen thumper trucks around here? Okay. So up here you set off, you run thumper trucks up and down the road, or you set off explosive charges, send sound waves down, sound waves bounce off all the rock layers, and the geologists can interpret that noise, and they can actually visualize what, in this case, the upper surface of the Marcellus looks like. Notice it's not perfectly flat, it's not perfectly horizontal. It's bent and folded and faulted. This is called a fault. Here's another fault. Here's another fault. But, hey, there's gas everywhere in there, so let's drill everywhere. That's what spatial intensity means. Pad, move a half mile, pad, move a half mile, pad, move a half mile, pad. On this pad, what appears to be one vertical is actually 6 verticals, with 3 laterals going north-northwest, 3 laterals going south-southeast. When Shell, this is a map put together by Shell, gets done developing this portion of Tioga County, there will be a lateral every 500 feet. This is 500 feet from here to here. There will be a lateral every 500 feet. Why? Where's the gas? Answer me. Where's the gas? Everywhere. If you have a warehouse, and everywhere in the warehouse you have a product, where do you want to leave the product in the warehouse? Answer, nowhere. Get it all out. If you want to get it all out, you use spatially intense development. You have pads in a uniform pattern on the surface, roughly a half a mile apart in one direction, roughly a mile and a half apart in the other direction, and on each pad you drill as many wells as you have capital to plug into the ground. Remember, each one of these wells is $5 million just to get down, another $3 or $4 million to complete. $6, $7, $8 million per well. So there's $50 million of capital investment. What does spatially intense development look like in a place where it's already happened? That is, the job is done. Here, the job is not yet done. Pennsylvania is just getting started. Hope you realize that. Let me tell you what I mean by that. There are only about 6,800 Marcellus wells that have been drilled in Pennsylvania since 2007. 6,800. The industry wants to drill a minimum of 100,000 Marcellus wells in Pennsylvania. So if you go to Pennsylvania right now and you look around, you might not see too much depending upon where you are, but remember, you're only 6.8% of the way into the play. Ask what it's going to look like when it's 50% done or 75% done. All right, let's go to Texas where it's already done. Barnett. Barnett Shale Play has 16,000 wells. Many of them are under the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. That's the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. Close your eyes. Open your eyes. That's what the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport looks like to shareholders in Chesapeake. Every one of those red dots is a pad location. Yes, a pad location on the airport property. They put pads everywhere except on the runways and in the terminal. Every red dot is a pad, every red line is a lateral. So they have 53 pads and 30 square miles. If you wanted to get all the gas, or as much of the gas as you could, out from underneath the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, that is spatially intense development. Now, for those of you who are wondering what it might look like around Tully, excuse me for telling you the truth. That's what it's going to look like. I'm pausing here for dramatic effect. And if you don't believe me, tell me right now, and tell me why you think I'm wrong. Okay, let's proceed. Another picture of the Barnett. Here's Dallas, Texas. Here's Fort Worth. Every one of those red or black dots is a pad location. Not a well, a pad. And every one of those pads has many wells. There's 16,000 wells in there. There's about 4,000 pads. I'm going to blow up that white box. Ready? Here's a scale, 1 mile, well, a little bit less, 4,500 feet from here to here. Every one of those white blobs is a pad location. Now, why would you think that the same companies that are producing gas in the Barnett in Texas would come to upstate New York and choose not to do that? Why would they choose to leave product in the warehouse? Why would they not use exactly the same technology that has been perfected in the Barnett, in the Fayetteville, in Pennsylvania in the Marcellus, in West Virginia in the Marcellus? What makes you think New York's going to be any different? Why would they be nicer to us here and not drill everywhere? Come on, get real. New York. As you know, we thought we were going to have regulations for shale gas development. We don't. 5 years later, we still don't have any. But there was a new law passed in New York in 2008 called the Compulsory Integration Law in preparation for shale gas development. Before any of our legislators knew what the hell was going on, and before any of our grassroots organizations had organized, industry already knew what they were going to get, what they could get in New York, they can't get in Pennsylvania. Compulsory integration. How does it work? A company defines what's called a spacing unit, an area on the surface, usually more or less rectangular. And a company applies for a permit from our DEC to develop shale gas wells within that area, called a spacing area. And if a company can get the agreement of landowners that control 60% of the land in that spacing unit, the people who control the other 40% have nothing to say about it. They are compulsorily integrated. Got it? That's the law of the land in New York State. There is no compulsory integration in Pennsylvania, by the way, so when the industry said to our legislature in 2008, we have to have compulsory integration, otherwise we're never going to be able to develop shale gas. They were lying through their teeth. Because in Pennsylvania they don't have compulsory integration, and obviously Pennsylvania is well on its way toward development. Yes, sir?
Yeah, is there an issue of mineral rights versus surface rights in Pennsylvania that makes the compulsory integration not an issue?
In some cases, yes. In some cases in Pennsylvania, they have what's called split estate, not as common in New York as it is in Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania has been mineralogically developed much more than New York State. So in many cases in Pennsylvania, they didn't need compulsory integration because the people who owned the surface rights didn't own the mineral rights. But in most cases in Pennsylvania, they don't have split estate, and the people went along with it because it was before they were wise enough to figure out that it probably wasn't something they wanted to do. More about the cultural differences between New York and Pennsylvania later. Good question. Anyway, permit applications, these are two different ones. The idea is this company wanted 640 acres, 1 square mile, 2 miles by half mile, 2 miles by half a mile. The company wanted to put a pad here and drill 5 wells north-northwest, 5 wells south-southeast. Why? Why would they want a spacing unit that's not circular or not square, but rather rectangular, 2 miles long, a half mile wide, and oriented in that particular direction. Why? Because the natural fractures have certain orientations which geologists can identify, and the idea is to make these wells intersect as many of those natural hydraulic fractures as possible. So you will see almost uniformly throughout the Marcellus in New York and northern Pennsylvania that pads, and I'll show you pads in Pennsylvania, orient their wells north, northwest, south, southeast. All right?
So is that saying there's one pad for every 640 acres?
Yes, one pad per 640 acres. One pad per 640 acres is currently the limit. What is the limit in the proposed SGEIS and was to be regulatorily imposed by the now defunct regulations in New York State? So we're not really sure yet. But what industry wants is a minimum of 640 acres because it turns out that that's a sweet spot. Roughly 80 surface acres per well, so roughly 8 wells per square mile. I'll show you examples of that in Pennsylvania in a minute. All right, Tully, I think we're somewhere right about here. So I'm going to superimpose on this map, and this is a 2-mile scale. From here to here is 2 miles. And I'm going to superimpose what would be, from an industry point of view, an absolutely ideal arrangement of spacing units. Before I show it to you, you should already know what I'm going to show you. If you want to get as much gas out of the play as possible, how would you arrange your spacing units? Would you leave any space between them?
No.
Yes or no? No. Bingo. Okay. Each one of these yellow rectangles is 2 miles long, half mile wide. Each red square would be the location of the pad, and the company would drill 6, 8, 10, 12 wells, whatever they want, depending upon their capital, in each of those spacing units. And yes, they could put a pad between these 2 kettle lakes, because right now we don't have any regulations that say they couldn't. Maybe the new regulations will say they couldn't, but right now there's nothing stopping them. And yes, they could drill laterals underneath the lakes. Might be 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 feet down, depending upon which shale formation they want to go after. But because each one of these laterals can be a mile or 2 long, in this case they're only a mile long, they could do that. And north, northwest, south, southeast. The only thing that would stop this from happening, if permitting occurs, 2 things. You and geology. What do I mean by geology? Well, it could turn out that they do some exploration wells, and it turns out that it's not likely to be very profitable to drill wells in this area, so they might choose not to. You're landowners. So if you don't permit this, that is, you do not engage in signing leases that would permit that kind of spatially intense development, then it can't happen. If one landowner controlled 60% of the land in this image, one landowner can negotiate with one operator, one gas company, to make that happen. That would be what I call industrially ideal. Companies don't want to compete with each other. Question: how many gas operators are currently trying to produce Marcellus gas in Pennsylvania? I'm going to give you a couple choices. Over 1,000, between 50 and 100, fewer than 10.
Fewer than 10.
Wrong. 68. Really? There's 68 different companies trying to develop Marcellus shale in Pennsylvania? Yeah, last time I looked. It could be a little more than that now. It might be 65, it might be 70. Last time I counted it was 68. So those companies compete with each other. They're not all good buddies, by the way. You know, the big guys are trying to buy up the middle guys are trying to buy up the small guys, and then foreign companies are trying to buy up big guys. But if you had one company that can convince the landowners that control 60% of the land in that area to all get together with that one company, that's what would happen.
Question.
Yes?
Of those 68, how many are foreign owned?
I don't know, but many. Don't know. But you can look it up. That's all public information.
When you talk about geology, part of that area is right over an aquifer. How can you drill through an aquifer?
Drill through aquifers all the time. There's no way to drill an oil or gas well 5,000 feet underground and anywhere in the Northeast, Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York, without drilling through the aquifer. It might not be a sole source aquifer like you have here. It might not only be 30 feet underground, but there's always an aquifer. And you always have to punch a hole through it to drill down with your vertical to create your lateral. That should not be a surprise. Anytime you drill a water well, by definition, you're punching a hole in the aquifer. Anytime you're drilling a gas or oil well, even the ones that are already in New York, we drill holes through aquifers. But we never drilled this many holes in such a small area anywhere in New York State. And risk goes up with intensity. All right, some of you think I'm blowing smoke. I'm inventing this. Even though I told you, if you think I'm telling you incorrect information, you're supposed to challenge me. I'm going to prove to you that this is what's happening. This is a map put together by Shell. You've heard of them. This is Tioga County, Pennsylvania. Here's the New York, Pennsylvania line right here. This is Tioga County, Pennsylvania. Here are the different townships. And this is Shell telling the Environmental Protection Agency that this is their lease holdings. Every one of these more or less rectangular areas, I'll blow it up so you can see a little better. Those are lease holdings. Those are spacing units that Shell controls. Now, I said there are 68 companies operating in Pennsylvania. You can bet that much of this other land is already leased by many of those other companies, but this is what Shell controls. And you'll notice north, northwest, south, southeast. You notice the black dots is the location of where they're going to put their pads, and there will be 2,000 wells on those pads when Shell is done in Tioga County. And you're probably wondering, well, they won't do that close to cities. Okay, so here's Mansfield. Here's Wellsboro. I'm not lying. This is a Shell document handed to the Environmental Protection Agency. I was at a workshop last week in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, at the EPA Research Campus, and I participated in the workshop on wellbore integrity. And I was one of 2 academics that participated in that workshop, along with about a dozen representatives of oil and gas industries. So the good deal about going to a workshop like that is I get to take home industry data and come and show it to you. You don't have to go to the workshop. I'm bringing it to you. All right, that's how the process works, in theory. You got to have spatially intense development. You got to be able to drill vertically. You got to be able to drill a lateral. You got to be able to inject a lot of frac fluid at very high pressure. You got to be able to make sure that you develop as much of the gas resource as possible by drilling laterals roughly every 500 feet in every direction.
Tony, quick question. With that lateral, is that above the shale or in the shale?
In the shale.
In the shale.
In the shale.
Thank you.
Good question. So this looks like it's above the shale, but the idea is you make that lateral more or less go through the middle of the shale so that you can, when you frack up to the top of the shale, down to the bottom of the shale, and laterally about 500 feet in each direction. Idea, if the shale is really thick in some places in shales in the Northeast, the shale is thick, 500 feet thick, 1,000 feet thick. You can have wells on top of each other, 2 layers of laterals, 3 layers of laterals being done. Okay, let me move along to the second topic. What does this really look like on the surface in places where it's already going on? So I'm going to show you a series of photographs and videos from various locations in North America and delineate for you not just what a pad looks like, and not just what a single well on a pad looks like, but what multiple well pads look like, and what clustered pads look like, and all the other, what I call ancillary infrastructure, fancy words. What else do you need besides wells and pads to get the gas to market? Well, you need dehydration stations, you need compression stations, you need processing units, and you need pipelines. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Let's go first to a place where the industry has been pioneering. This is a relatively new process. Shale gas development, according to the way I just showed you, is 6 years old. Fracking is 46 years old. But shale gas development, using the 4 technologies I just described, is 6 years old. So where does the industry cut its teeth? Where do they do experiments? Well, where would you do it? Someplace where nobody notices. Northeastern British Columbia. Anybody been up there recently? Notice the number of grassroots organizations having meetings in town halls, in high school auditorium. Okay, Northeastern British Columbia, up until about a year ago, I don't know now, this was the largest frac job anywhere in the world. 16 wells on one pad. This is, as we say, not your grandfather's gas well. This is not 4 acres. There's the data for this particular pad. Read it. And since we're talking about what happens on the surface, let's talk about all of it. Let's not put blinders on and imagine that sand, which is used as a proppant, suddenly just appears. It has to come from someplace. So let's imagine where the 78,400 tons of sand came from for fracking those wells. It came from Wisconsin. Sand from Wisconsin? Can't they just use any kind of sand in these wells? Well, no. What's the purpose of the sand? To prop open the natural fractures. Under what pressure? Thousands and thousands of pounds per square inch. Is it possible to crush a sand grain? Sure. Depends upon what the sand's made of. Is all sand the same? No. What's the strongest sand known? Silica sand. Crushed quartz. Where is the best source of silica sand in the United States? Upper Midwest. That's the kind of industrial development, spatially intense industrial development, that our fellow citizens in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois are now seeing. They're not seeing shale gas development. They're seeing an antecedent to shale gas development, silica sand mining. Farmers are selling off their land to be mined for silica sand. Silica sand is then shipped by truck to a railhead. It then goes in rail cars, and it's shipped by rail to Wyalusing, Pennsylvania. Drove by there yesterday. These are sand trucks. This is a daycare center. Here's the unloading facility. There's a rail yard right here. I'll show it to you in a minute. Here are the conveyors unloading the silica sand from the rail cars by conveyor into the trucks. This is blowing silica sand. This wall is this wall right here, and here's the daycare center. Anybody know what silica sand does if you breathe it? It can cause silicosis. It's a chronic and eventually deadly disease of the lungs. So the workers, by OSHA requirements, have to wear respirators. The children don't. Okay, what else has to happen? You have to build pads. And these are not 4-acre pads with one well. This pad has 5 wellheads. You can see them here. And at one time it had not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 waste pits. Waste pits are built first to store fresh water, and then to store drilling mud, and ultimately to store frac flowback fluid. Another thing that happens, especially in an area like this, is they kill a lot of trees. Now think about the irony. It's Earth Day. What is the single most important defense that the human species has against climate change? Trees. How many acres of trees were destroyed to put up that pad? 7-well pad. Nothing in the regulations that New York State proposed said anything about replanting the damn trees. I'm getting angry here on Earth Day. But again, pads and wells are just part of the infrastructure. You have waste pits, but you also have things like storage facilities for chemical tanks, for chemical trucks, storage facilities for condensate tanks, because if the gas is wet, you're collecting not only methane, but propane, butane, ethane, natural gas liquids. Those have to be separated out and stored, along with brine, produced water, flowback fluid. They're all the same thing, by the way, in case you were wondering. Professor Ingraffea, what's the difference between produced water, brine, and flowback fluid? Professor Ingraffea answers, nothing. They're just different names for the same thing. Why are they called different things? Because if you call them different things, regulations allow you to do different things with it. That's called wool over the eyes. Okay, so Mr. and Mrs. Chappell really didn't like this impoundment dam behind their house, and they didn't like the condensate tanks here, they didn't like the 7-well pad here, but they didn't have it nearly as bad as some of these other people who had not only the wells on different pads, and not only wastewater pits, and not only compressor stations, but they also had a processing facility. What's a processing facility? Anybody know?
Probably takes what comes out of the ground and separates it into its
Yes, it is. It's a mini refinery. If what comes out of the ground is wet gas, you want to separate out methane, propane, butane, ethane. You do that by the same process that you see in a refinery. And what you can't see here is every one of these wells on every pad has to be connected by pipeline to a compressor station and a processing station. Okay, now there is much alleged in the proposed New York regulations, which I repeat are now defunct. New York State doesn't have any regulations yet for shale gas development, but there was much made in the proposed regulations that New York is not going to do what Pennsylvania did. We're not going to have open pits, except in certain circumstances. For example, if a company chooses to recycle, they need to have a place to temporarily dump the flowback fluid and store it there so they can recycle it. Okay, little exception. Except if you're living in that house or that house, these are Mac mansions, by the way. You know, these are people that moved out in the countryside, built themselves their dream homes, and suddenly in their backyard. This is 300 feet. This is a waste pit that was used as a super mister, M-I-S-T-E-R. What's a super mister? Every one of these things is a fountain that's being sprayed up. So tanker trucks come, dump frac flowback fluid, shot up in the air so that some of it evaporates. What's in the frac flowback fluid? BTEX. How do I know that? How can it not be? What comes up out of the well is BTEX. So it's evaporating, and if the wind's blowing in that direction, and you got your windows open, then you've got a problem. Okay, not your grandfather's frac job. Every one of these trucks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, each one of those is a 1,000 horsepower diesel engine pumper. It's 16,000 horsepower. Fracking 1, 2, 3, 4 wells, one at a time. The white stuff is snow on the ground. Notice the date. Fracking and drilling are done 24/7, 365. Why? Time is money. Where can they put pads? Top of Song Mountain? You think Song Mountain would be out of bounds for building pads? Answer the question. Thank you. Okay, why? We hear all about mountaintop removal from coal, and that's a bad thing. Nobody wants to see that continue to happen. I don't hear anybody talk about mountaintop removal for gas. So where can they put pads? Anywhere they want. They can take the top off of the mountain, they can build up the side of the mountain, or they can remove the side of the mountain. Why? Gas is everywhere. Spatially intense development means you put your pads in the uniform grid on the surface, drill down, show your laterals 500 feet apart. Flares. A flare is a purposeful burning off the product that you drilled a well to take to market. CIA or FBI? Okay, a flare is a purposeful burning off of the product for which you drilled the well to take to market. So this well was just fracked. It's in fracked flowback period, that is, millions of gallons of what was pumped down the well is now surging back up the well at very high rates and very high pressure. Literally hundreds of gallons per second. Mixed in with the fracked flowback fluid is gas. 3 things a company can do at this point. All 3 of them are bad. There's bad, worse, and worser. The worst thing they can do is allow the gas that's coming back with the liquid to just vent into the atmosphere. And I'll show you a video of what that looks like in a few minutes. So there's no pipeline in place. There's no place to take the gas that's coming back up the well initially and send it to market. So it becomes a waste product. There's no pipeline. And you got to get that fluid out of the well. You can't pump it down there and leave it down there. It has to come back up. So you just vent the gas. That's the worser thing. The slightly less worser thing is you separate the gas from the liquid and you send the gas to a flare and you burn it. You don't send it to market. The people who live here, I guess, we're going to get royalties. Their royalties are going up in smoke. That's gas that never gets to market. They never get a royalty on it. The third thing they could do is wise. They could have a pipeline in place already, and they could abide by a regulation that doesn't exist in any state in the country, which is if you drill a well and frack a well, you better be prepared to separate the gas that comes up from the first, second, and take it to market. Why don't companies do that? If you drove through Pennsylvania tonight, anybody drive through Pennsylvania recently at night? Yes or no? I have. There's flares all over the place. When I was driving back from Wyalusing last night, there were flares going, the night was lit up. Why is that? Why don't companies just separate out the gas and send it to market? No pipelines. Why no pipelines? Pipelines cost money. Okay, it's cheaper for them to drill the well, frack the well, let the flowback occur, flare off or vent off the gas, then shut in the well and wait for the price of gas to go back up. They don't care to waste at $3.90 a thousand. They're losing money. Might as well burn it. Weren't going to make any money on it. It's a profit not making operation, so it doesn't matter to burn it. Flares will run 24/7, 365. Map of the United States at night from a NASA satellite showing light. Here's Chicago all lit up. Here's Minneapolis all lit up. Here's the northwest corner of North Dakota all lit up. What cities are there in northwestern North Dakota?
Williston.
Yeah. How big is Williston?
Not big.
Not big. Why is it all lit up? Those are thousands of flares. Thousands of flares. Well, why don't they send that gas to market? No pipeline. Why didn't they build a pipeline? Because they didn't want the gas. What do they want out of the Bakken? Oil. So think about that. We're a nation. We have natural resources. Are you listening, Natural Resources Defense Council? Are you listening, Environmental Defense Fund? Are you listening in Sierra Club? We have resources. They're national resources. They belong to us. They don't belong to the companies. The companies just lease them from us. And yet we're willing to take our children's and our grandchildren's inheritance of natural gas. This is the same natural gas, by the way, that President Obama says will last us 100 years. Except it's being burned off because it's a waste product. Being burned as a waste. Thank you. The single most effective way of increasing patriotism, bringing our troops home from the Middle East, okay, and being true Americans, is to engage in better energy conservation. Americans are energy pigs. Yep. Per capita, we use far more energy than any other country on the face of the earth. So the simplest way to be patriotic and bring kids home, conserve energy. And, for example, don't waste light energy. Okay, let me move along. That's what a compressor station looks like. They're depending upon the geology, the local geology. As you know, the gas which comes up the first day from a well comes up at the highest pressure and the highest flow rate. So if you're a landowner and you're looking to make money on royalties, you'll never make more money than you make the first day. Every day after that, you will make less money, because the gas naturally decreases in pressure and decreases in rate of flow as time goes by. Eventually, a gas well will start producing gas at such a low pressure that you can't get it into a pipeline. The transmission pipelines that want to take the gas, for example, from here to Boston or New York City operate at about 1,000 pounds per square inch. Those are transmission lines, the long distance lines. The pressure in those lines is about 1,000 pounds per square inch. If the gas coming out of the well is only a couple hundred pounds per square inch, it has to be compressed. Pressure has to be increased, and that's what this is. Inside those buildings are, this is Buffalo, I think there are 4,500 compressors, 4,500 horsepower compressors in those buildings, running 24/7, 365, collecting gas from multiple wells, increasing its pressure so it can go into a pipeline. They're noisy. And they emit lots of methane from leaks. All right, moving along. How often do wells leak into water wells and surface waters? Remember, every time you drill an oil or gas well, or any time you drill any well, you got to poke a hole through the aquifer. And if you poke a hole through the aquifer, you better gasket the well. What's in that hole? Steel casing. What's the difference between the diameter of the steel casing and the diameter of the hole that you drill? Let's see how intelligent you are. Okay? The diameter of the steel casing that's in the hole is larger than the diameter of the hole? Exactly the same as the diameter of the hole? Smaller. Which means, once you put the steel casing in, there's a gap. Initially, there's a gap between the outside of the steel casing and the hole that you drilled. If you leave that gap open all the way to the bottom, what's to stop anything that's down there from coming up outside the well? Nothing. So what do companies do? Since time immemorial, they put a gasket in. What's the gasket? Hardened cement paste. Cement powder, add water. Pump it down the well, have it return up the outside of the steel casing. That's called the annulus, that gap, annulus. And fill that annulus so that you now have a seal. Except you're making a steel with a material that is fundamentally brittle. It's not reinforced concrete, it's not fiber reinforced concrete, it's not resin reinforced concrete, it's not pliable, flexible rubber, it's hardened cement paste, which tends to shrink, which tends to crack, and which tends to channel. So how often do wells leak? That's the production casing of a well. This one's in Pennsylvania. And what you saw in the video when I first got up here to talk was bubbling. This is water. Companies usually leave what's called a cellar, an excavated area at the wellhead. And that excavated area typically fills with rainwater or snowmelt. So you literally have a pool of water around the wellhead. It's a telltale. If the well is leaking outside the production casing, which should never happen, you will see bubbling. It's called bubbling in the cellar. That's what it looks like. How often does it happen? I'll show you 3 pieces of data. And again, this is industry data. You can go look it up yourself. Schlumberger asked engineers to go look at all 9,000 Gulf of Mexico wells. This was back in 2003. And they determined which of those wells was leaking. And then they put the wells into categories. Brand new wells were leaking at the rate of about 5%. 1 out of every 20 was leaking. Wells that were 10 years old, about 30% were leaking. Wells that were 20 years old, well, about 50% were leaking. And by the time wells got to be about 30 years old, about 60% were leaking. So should the New York State DEC be convinced by this data that wells that will be drilled in New York will leak? I'm asking you a serious question.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be convinced. I wouldn't be convinced. Those are offshore wells in the Gulf of Mexico. They're not shale gas wells. That's what DEC told me. Irrelevant data.
Okay.
So I'm a good researcher. Cornell's been paying me to do it for 37 years. I know where to dig. We used to go to libraries to dig. You don't have any libraries anymore. It's easier. You just go to Google and say, leaking wells. And then you get this data. So I read this paper. SPE stands for the Society of Petroleum Engineers. I is one. I'm a member. This is paper number 106,817, published 4 years ago. This is data for 340,000 wells onshore in Canada. These are all Canadian wells, onshore wells. Not offshore, not Gulf of Mexico, Canada. And the data says, well, brand new wells are leaking at the rate of about 2%, but as they age, the leak rate goes up. So but by the time they're about 15 years old, about 10% of them are leaking. Well, that appears to be better, except let's look at deviated wells. The industry has all these ominous words. Deviated well. A deviated well is a well that is not straight down. For example, like a shale gas well. So this is data from the same paper. SCVF is sustained casing vent flow. GM is gas migration. So inspectors went to each of these 340,000 wells and determined whether in any of the annuli there was sustained gas flow, meaning the well was leaking. Or they went to a wellhead and they put probes in the ground around the wellhead to detect whether any methane was migrating up through the earth. And what they found is that for all the wells they looked at, on average, there was about 9% SCVF and about 5% GM. But when they looked at all the wells that were deviated, 65% of them were showing one or the other. In other words, 65% of the wells were leaking. 2 weeks ago, I participated in a webinar. You all know about webinars, right? You sign up for them on the web and you get a speech. In this case, it was an SPE web event. Society of Petroleum Engineers asked one of their best petroleum engineers to give a webinar to the public on well bore integrity. That's fancy jargon from the industry, well bore integrity. A well has integrity if it's not leaking. A well has lost its integrity if it is leaking. This is a slide from that presentation, given by Paul Hoffman, March 27, 2013. Industry will drill more wells in the next decade than have been drilled in the last 100 years. That's good to know. The global well population, all the gas and oil wells drilled in the world, 1.8 million, of which plus or minus 35% are leaking. So if there are people in this room that think we're special, we're New York, our wells aren't going to leak, give me a good reason why they wouldn't. That's the history of the industry. But that's ancient history. I don't believe in ancient history. I want to know, give me the best data that would be a prognosticator, that would be the best indicator of what would happen if we permitted shale gas development in New York State today. I wouldn't rely on Gulf of Mexico. I wouldn't rely on Canadian data. I wouldn't rely on that very vague statement that of all the wells that have ever been drilled, 35% of them are leaking. I want to know which ones to be drilled today in New York State using the best available technology, the best cement, the best people, the best protocols. How many are going to leak? That's a good question. I know the answer. No time to go into all the different leaking mechanisms. So my colleague Renee Santoro at Cornell and I dug into the most recent industry experience, relevant experience. We went to Pennsylvania. And we looked at the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection database, which is online, open to the public. You can repeat our experiment if you want. It's going to take you weeks, but you can do it. Go into the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection database on all the Marcellus wells that have been drilled in the last 3 years, roughly 6,700 wells, and look at the inspection reports for each one. Each well has multiple inspection reports, so you're going to have to read over 10,000 inspection reports. And if the well, when it was inspected, was issued a violation for leaking, you know that that well is leaking. Well, that's one way of figuring out how many wells leak in the Marcellus in Pennsylvania over the last 3 years. Except there's a problem with that approach. It turns out that just because a well is leaking in Pennsylvania, and even though that violates any one of 6 regulations, a well is not necessarily given a violation for leaking. Because starting in 2010, inspectors in Pennsylvania weren't allowed to issue violations on site. They had to send the prospective violation to Harrisburg and have DEP Harrisburg decide whether the well was in violation or not. So we went farther. We dug into each inspection report and we read the inspector's comments. Inspector goes to the well and she writes down comments. Required. Comment section. Comment. This well is bubbling in the cellar. This well has sustained casing vent flow. This well has sustained annular pressure. This well has been squeezed 4 times. Each of those indicate that the well has failed. So we counted up all the wells that had failed, whether they had gotten violations or not, and here's what we found. In 2010, 6% of the wells, these are brand new wells by the way, had failed. In 2011, went up to 7%. In 2012, went up to almost 9%. That data is not unlike that data, or that data. Why should it be? Same companies, same protocols, same cement, same drilling procedures, same casing and placement procedures. Why would you expect anything different? Companies are doing as well as they can. They don't want their wells to leak. It's just darn difficult to make a well that doesn't leak. You can't be sure that any well won't leak. And what this data says is that's about the rate of failure you'd expect. Why would any of the 65 companies or 68 companies currently operating in Pennsylvania, if they were allowed to come across the border and start drilling, cementing, and casing wells in New York, why would you suspect that the answer here would be any different? Because they say so? Okay, so if anywhere between 6 and 9% of the wells are going to leak, and they're going to drill anywhere between 50 to 100,000 Marcellus and Utica wells in New York, how many wells are going to leak? Thousands. Thousands. How many water wells will be contaminated? We don't know. What's the scientific connection between a leaking gas well and a contaminated water well? Really complex. It is not true. I'm going to say 2 things here. Listen very closely. It is not true that if a gas well leaks, it will necessarily contaminate your water well. It depends upon the geohydrology or the hydrogeology. On the other hand, it is also true that one leaking gas well can contaminate many water wells, again, because of the hydrogeology. Has anybody done the science to figure out how frequently that frequency of failed gas wells contaminates water wells? No. Then why are we going to permit it? How do you price out the cost of decontaminating people's water wells if you don't know how many water wells are going to be contaminated? That's a rhetorical question. Okay, I'll skip that video. Let's go to the last topic so we can get some Q&A going. Is shale gas a clean fossil fuel? You've all seen commercials on TV about how natural gas is fueling a revolution in America, making us energy independent, energy secure, and replacing coal, and therefore making climate change slower. Stupid, absurd, wrong. And I'd be glad to discuss any one of those 3, but let's concentrate on the last one. Climate change, basics. Ready? Climate change 101. Anthropogenic climate change. Climate change, also called climate instability, also called global warming. Anthropogenic means being influenced by humans. One thing for sure that everybody agrees on is that the concentration of carbon dioxide, CO2, in the Earth's atmosphere continues to rise. Here's what it was in 2007. Here's what it was in December 2012. It's going up close to 400 parts per million. It hasn't been that high in the last 100,000 years. And it's gotten that high very quickly. Like in the last 100 years since the beginning, 200 years since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But that's only part of the story. CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It's well known from chemistry, atmospheric chemistry, that you put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you get global warming. Here's what you don't know. This is methane concentration in the atmosphere. Notice it's also rising. Why is that important? Methane is also a greenhouse gas. All we ever hear about is carbon dioxide. Carbon sequestration, carbon tax, decrease carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by decreasing the burning of fossil fuels. Important. Absolutely important. But it's not the only part of the story. The other part of the story that's just as important is the story about methane, natural gas, CH4. Methane is also a greenhouse gas, and it turns out that it's more powerful as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. I'll explain it to you this way. Take 1 kilogram of carbon dioxide, 1 kilogram of methane, put them into the atmosphere, wait some period of time, and find out which of them heated the atmosphere more. The ratio of how much the methane heated the atmosphere to how much the carbon dioxide heated the atmosphere is called the global warming potential, GWP. Told you you're going to learn a lot of acronyms tonight. So how much more does that kilogram of methane heat the atmosphere than that kilogram of carbon dioxide? Depends upon how long you're willing to wait. If you want to wait 100 years, methane is 33 times more potent than carbon dioxide. If you only want to wait 20 years, it's over 100 times more potent. Let me make sure you understand that. If you're only worried about the next 20 years in climate change, and you should be, if you're only worried about the next 20 years, then that 1 kilogram of methane heats the atmosphere as much as 100 kilograms of carbon dioxide. Where does the methane come from? 40% of the United States comes from natural gas activities, like fracking. Okay. So this is a photograph of a frack site in Dimmitt. This is a close-up. Flowback is occurring. So they frack the well, fluid is flowing back, and remember I told you there are 3 things they can do with it. The gas that comes back up the well during flowback. One is they vent it directly into the atmosphere, and that's a very large source of methane, has a global warming potential of over 120 years. So I'm going to show you one more video tonight. I'm showing you this still picture taken of that same pad. This is water vapor. What you can't see is methane. Methane is colorless, odorless, tasteless. So you won't be able to see it with the naked eye. But we're going to use one of the miracles of modern technology in methane in a color. And it's being shown here as yellow. So that same well pad that you saw in visible light was just showing water vapor is also emitting large quantities of methane. And you'll see when we get to the end of this video in about 10 seconds, that piece of heavy equipment that I showed you in the previous photograph will come into the frame, and you'll see for scale how big those clouds of methane are. Okay, so Professor Howarth, Renee Santor, and I wrote a paper back in 2011. It was the paper that caused a lot of problems, because we wrote a paper in 2011 that says there's a tremendous amount of methane being vented into the atmosphere from oil and gas operations, and from coal operations, and from oil operations, but much more for natural gas operations. And the industry didn't want to hear that. We made a prediction 2 years ago that anywhere between 3.6 and 7.9% of all the natural gas being produced out of shale gas wells in the United States was never being burned. It was leaking, either purposely or accidentally leaking. We wrote that paper in what scientists call a paper study. We didn't go out and measure anything. We didn't go out there and measure the amount of methane coming off a drill pad or leaking out of a pipe. A couple of professors in Cornell, you kidding? It takes millions of dollars and thousands of people. Drove down streets that didn't have pipelines, they would still be measuring methane because It doesn't just stay on the street where it's leaking. It depends upon atmospheric conditions, but good question. Another question is, how do they know that the gas that they're measuring is pipeline gas? How do they know it's not coming from some other source, like dead animals or sewer gas? How do they know that? Yeah, for captain. If it's gas in a pipeline, it's been treated with an odorant. They can also use isotopic analysis to determine whether the gas that goes through Citygate in Boston goes into the distribution system is of a certain isotopic signature, and the same machine that measures concentration does isotopic analysis. New York City. Read it. This is from a recent report, not yet peer-reviewed. Not peer-reviewed, but a report. This is peer-reviewed. 2.8%, roughly 2.9% of all the natural gas handled by Con Ed in Manhattan is leaking. It's only 2.8%. By the way, who pays for that loss? The people who buy the gas pay for it because they're paying for not only the gas they burn, but the gas that gets lost. Why? The very first research project I worked on in Cornell back in 1878 was for Con Ed. And they wanted to know something about their cast iron gas mains. You know what cast iron is? It's a brittle material that was made back in the 1800s, early 1900s in the pipeline. It was cheap. You know what a bell and spigot joint looks like? So you have one end of the pipe, just looks like pipe, and the other end looks like a bell, and you stick this pipe into that pipe to make an assembly of pipes. But you have to gasket that bell and spigot joint. What gasketing material do you think was common in the year 1900? Hemp. Lead-infused hemp. Okay, so 70% of the cast iron pipe in the Con Ed system is over 100 years old. No wonder it leaks. All right, getting to the end. These were the predictions we made in our paper in 2011, peer-reviewed journal. This is shale gas, conventional gas, coal, oil. Black is the impact on climate that you get from the carbon dioxide that you burn, that you get when you burn all these. These are all fossil fuels. You burn them, you get carbon dioxide. It is true, when you burn natural gas, you get less carbon dioxide than when you burn coal or burn oil. So when industry says natural gas is a clean fossil fuel, they're telling you the truth. They're just not telling you the whole truth. It's cleaner from the point of view of carbon dioxide, but carbon dioxide is not the only greenhouse gas. The other greenhouse gas is methane. So the pink is methane. And when we wrote that paper, we estimated that the right answer was somewhere between here and here. We don't know. We won't know until the measurements are made. The measurements are just starting to be made. I just showed you some of them. But if we're right, on the one hand, I hope we're right. On the other hand, I hope we're wrong. But if we're right, that makes shale gas the dirtiest of all fossil fuels, taking into account not only carbon dioxide, but methane. So if you're thinking of substituting the use of natural gas for coal for electricity generation, not smart. If you're thinking about trying to convince Detroit to start building automobiles and trucks that burn natural gas instead of gasoline, not smart. Last slide on climate change. You got the patience for it? Published last year in Science, it's a prestigious magazine, journal. This is the best available prediction of our climate future a year ago. I'll explain it to you. Year, temperature relative to a baseline of the Earth's atmosphere. How do we know that the Earth is warming? We have tens of thousands of thermometers all over the world constantly measuring atmospheric temperature at different locations, different altitudes. Squiggly line, actual measured data, starting from 1900 up until 2010. The Earth's atmosphere had warmed by about 0.8 of 1 degree centigrade, 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Doesn't sound like much. warning zone. If we ever get to 1.5 degrees warming, when you see what's happening with climate change at 0.8 of a degree, you can use your imagination what kind of additional bad things happen in terms of storm intensity, melting of Greenland ice cap, melting of polar ice cap, rising of sea level, melting of permafrost in the Arctic. We don't want to get into the warning zone. We certainly don't want to get to the danger zone, which all competent climate scientists say begins when we get to 2 degrees warming. So here's where we were in 2010. These are computer predictions, 4 of them. Computer model predictions. Very sophisticated, very complex software full of assumptions, simplifications, and we don't knows. How can you rely on a computer program to predict climate future? Many people don't. They just want to wait and see what happens. We don't have a choice, by the way. You either continue the experiment and see what happens, or you make your best available scientific predictions and predict what happens and hope policy changes don't let happen what the computer program predicts will happen. Your choice. By the way, the same computer programs are used to predict the weather, except you're only predicting weather up to a week or 2 out. Here we're trying to predict climate years out. So they get less reliable as time goes on. And here are the reliability indices. So this purple line has a reliability from here to here. The best estimate of the scientist said that prediction could be down here or it could be up here. Here's the middle of it. This light blue one, that could be down here, it could be up here. That's the average. Got the idea? No computer prediction can be accurate, can be exact. It has an error associated with it. What are these 4 curves? First one, purple, is business as usual. We make no attempt as a species worldwide to decrease the increasing use of fossil fuels. As a species, every year we increase the use of fossil fuels. More coal, more oil, more natural gas is burned this year than last year. For the foreseeable future, that would be business as usual, and the computer model says in the year 2042, we're in the red zone. Tell your children that, and your grandchildren. If we had started in 2002 to try to decrease CO2 emissions by decreasing the use of fossil fuels, not only decreasing the increased use, but actually decreasing the use of fossil fuels, the computer models say that we delay getting into the red zone to about the year 2050. Buy ourselves 5 years. If we had started in 2010, decreasing methane emissions and decreasing black carbon emissions, BC stands for black carbon, also called soot. When a diesel engine isn't running clean, you see the black stuff, that's soot. That's soot. This is a processing plant in southwestern Pennsylvania. What's a processing plant? Separates methane, propane, butane, and the waste product is burned off, and it creates soot. 24/7, 365. If we had started in 2010 to drastically decrease methane emissions by decreasing the production of natural gas because it leaks, and decreasing black carbon, computer models say we delay getting into the red zone until 2070. We buy our kids an extra 20 years, but we still get into the red zone, and our grandkids aren't going to like that. What we should have done is decreased all 3. Decrease the production and use of all fossil fuels and black carbon. Computer models say we never get into the red zone. We get into the yellow zone, that's going to be bad enough, but we give our kids and our grandkids a chance. So why should we be worried about the next 20 years and not the next 100 years? President Obama says we have 100 years of natural gas. My reply is we won't get to use the last 70 years of it. 2010. This is 2040. We're now 2013. All right, conclude, because I want to give time for questions. In my opinion, all this talk about shale gas is being perpetrated on us by companies who obviously have a financial conflict of interest in it. Why would the oil and gas industry want to give up their industry? Why would they want to give up before they got the last barrel of oil, the last pound of coal, and the last cubic foot of gas out of the ground? Why would they be encouraging switch to renewables? That's suicide. It's business suicide. Why would you want your competitor to succeed? So shale gas development is, in my opinion, what a very famous scientist at Stanford calls it. It's a delaying tactic. But that graph I just showed you, if you're convinced of it, or at least worried about it, there's no time to waste. Delay is dangerous. We have to decide whether we're in the business of delaying bad outcomes by, for example, substituting natural gas for coal. That's really smart. Burn another fossil fuel for another fossil fuel because we can get this natural gas out of the ground now when we couldn't. We got to decide whether we're in the business of delaying bad outcomes or whether we're in the business of preventing bad outcomes. And at this point in time, the only thing that we can do to prevent a bad outcome is one of the things that this gentleman has suggested, which is use less energy. It's the simplest thing to do. We wouldn't really crimp our style in the U.S. if we all decided to use 10% less energy than we do. Substitute renewables as fast as we can for fossil fuels. Renewables are not in the future, they're here now. I'll leave you with two more simple statistics to remember at your next cocktail party. In December of 2012 and January of 2013, 100% of all new electricity generation in the United States came from wind and solar. In December 2012 and January 2013, 100% of all new electricity generation capacity in the United States came from wind and solar. None of it came from natural gas. In 2012, 40% of all new electricity generation in the United States came from wind and solar. So anybody that tells you wind and solar are way in the future, they can't pay for themselves, they're uneconomic, the technology is not there, is lying. I can show you lots of data during Q&A that shows you that other countries and other states in the United States are well on their way towards the eventual renewable revolution that we have to have. So I'll conclude by saying that if you want more reliable information, you can go to this website for my organization, or you go to this website for another organization I belong to. And these are very deep websites where only high-value, vetted information, peer-reviewed journal information, and government reports will be found. No blogs, no public opinion, no personal opinion. What you find there is what's given to you by the scientific community and by the government. So thank you very much for your attention and participating this evening. Look forward to more Q&A.
When the gas comes up like that and they're flared out, did they put it in a pipeline at that time, or did it have too much pressure to even go through a pipeline?
Excellent question. In order to separate the gas from the liquid during flowback, because it's coming back at such a high rate and high pressure, it requires special equipment called reduced emission completion equipment, REC equipment, REC, also called green completion equipment. So it is technically feasible from the very first second to separate the gas from the liquid. But the company has to be able to have on site this specialized equipment. There's a problem. The EPA has passed new regulations that say on January 1st, 2015, all new oil and gas wells have to have that equipment in place. Why not now? The answer is the industry wants to drill 25,000 wells in the United States in the next year. There are only 250 pieces of that equipment in the United States. Each of those pieces of equipment can only service maybe 12 wells, 1 well per month. So 250 times 12, 3,000 wells. If they want to drill 25,000, they can only do reduced emission completion on 3,000 of them. The industry asked for and was granted by the EPA a delay to January 1st, 2015 to build all that new equipment so that every new well will do exactly what you suggested. Immediately separate gas from the liquid, immediately put it into a pipeline, no flaring, no venting. Landowner comes out ahead, gas company comes out ahead, we all come out ahead.
Still have to have the pipeline.
Still have to have the pipeline in place. Who hasn't asked a question yet? Yes, ma'am.
Could you talk about the old existing gas wells that are no longer functioning, the legacy wells, and what the problems with that could be?
Point number one. This is a referee journal publication on industry performance in New York State pertaining to plugging of abandoned wells. By regulation, certainly in New York State and most other states, when the current owner of a gas or oil well decides to decommission that well, and that may not be the original owner, but when the current owner decides to decommission that well, they're obligated by regulation to plug it. The problem is that that regulation wasn't always around. And so of the many thousands of wells, for example, in 1994, there were 61,000 wells that the New York DEC knew existed in New York State. 61,000 oil and gas wells. 13,000 of them were still producing. 13,000 were abandoned and plugged. 35,000 were abandoned and unplugged. By 2009, the abandoned unplugged had gone up to 48,000. So 2/3 of all the oil and gas wells ever drilled in New York State are abandoned and unplugged. All right, so what does that mean? Well, if they're abandoned and unplugged, number one, we might know where they are. Number two, we might not know where they are. Because just because a well is abandoned and plugged, if it's abandoned and plugged, we know where it is. If it's abandoned and unplugged, we might not know where it is, because it could be a well from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and there are no records, except we know it exists, because there were production records. But there were no records kept of exactly where the well is. If a well is abandoned and unplugged, it could be leaking. It isn't necessarily leaking, but it could be leaking. What is another implication of that? Another risk. Is it possible to have an abandoned, unknown, unplugged well be so close to a proposed shale gas well that when you frack the shale gas well, you frack into the unknown, abandoned, unplugged well?
It occurred.
It has occurred at least twice that I know of, once in Pennsylvania, once in Texas in the last 3 years. There's a photograph of what it looks like. Fracking this well, and here was an abandoned, unknown, unplugged well, and they're pumping fluid down here, and they create a geyser. It also happened in Pennsylvania and Bradford County last year. So, consequences of old wells, if they're abandoned and plugged, hopefully that's good. By the way, just because you plug a well doesn't mean it won't leak. Plugging a well means pouring concrete down the production casing. If the well is leaking outside the production casing, plugging the well does not stop it from leaking. Got that? If the well is abandoned and unknown, and if it's leaking, one, it could be leaking liquids to the surface, it could be leaking gases to the surface, and it can become a conduit for an accident during subsequent fracking in shale formations. Is it going to happen every time? No. What's the probability of happening? The more wells you drill in an area where you already have drilling that has occurred, the higher the probability it will happen, if the companies haven't done due diligence to go out and try to find the wells that are abandoned and unknown. Forcing a company by regulation to determine whether in the area they're going to frack there are any abandoned unknown wells has been judged by the New York State DEC to be too onerous. If you go back and read the proposed regulations that are dead, the only thing a company is required to do is identify known abandoned wells. They're not required to identify unknown abandoned wells. I mean, how would you do that? I can tell you how it's done in Pennsylvania. Want to know? There's a club, student club. Pennsylvania has Last time I heard 200,000 abandoned unknown wells. 200,000. So there are clubs that have been formed by college students in Pennsylvania that do geocaching. You know, they go out on weekends with GPS units and they walk through the woods until they find an abandoned well, and they GPS it and send the GPS coordinates back to the Pennsylvania DEP. Volunteer. Yes. I'll get you next.
That imagery that you showed where the yellow indicated methane, can that be done from space? So that, for instance, in Pennsylvania, you know, where there are pinpoints of methane release where they can't explain why, then that might be an abandoned well.
Yes. I'm certainly not expert enough to be able to answer that question. I suspect the answer is yes, because let's face it, the Department of Defense uses technologies from outer space to detect a lot of things. You know, why not fly drones around while we're at it? But one of the points you made is very good. One of the projects that I'm engaged in right now at Cornell, in this area of measurement, we asked for it. We wrote that paper 2 years ago. We said, we better go out and measure things. It's going to take years to make all the measurements. We better get started. What we did is started the project a year ago with professors from Purdue and Penn State. The professor from Purdue owns a small plane, twin-engine small plane. And in that airplane, he put the same equipment that the people use to drive around the cities of New York and Boston. And we decided to fly over one county of Pennsylvania last summer, repeatedly over a few weeks. We flew over that county at low altitude, medium altitude, high altitude, morning, noon, and night, constantly making measurements of methane concentration in the atmosphere. Because we knew in that county that there were coal mines with coal mine vents, old oil and gas wells, and new shale gas wells. And we wanted to find out how much methane was being emitted into the atmosphere over a county. And we made the measurements, and then we tried to correlate what we were measuring with the activity on the ground. So first we eliminated all the methane from coal seams, because that has a certain isotopic signature that's different than methane from oil and gas wells. Then we determined from Pennsylvania DEP which wells were being fracked. None. Now that's interesting. We got really high readings of methane. None of it was coming from coal mines, and none of the wells were being fracked. And then we said, well, how many wells are being drilled? And they said, a lot of them. Wow. We're measuring methane that's coming out of the ground from wells that are being drilled. We hadn't thought about that. Nobody had thought about that. And so we thought about it, and we said, okay, so this is southwestern Pennsylvania. To get to the gas, they have to drill through coal seams. Every time you drill through a coal seam, you hit methane. And as you're drilling through the coal seam, up comes the methane. And they don't drill with liquid down there, they drill on air. You know what that means? You've heard of drilling mud? Well, they don't drill with drilling mud. They drill on high pressure compressed air to cool the drill bit, carry the rock chips up to the surface. So they're drilling on air, so they're pumping high pressure compressed air down the well. They go through a coal mine seam, they hit methane, and methane comes up into the atmosphere. Surprise. No one had ever measured it. That's a long way from answering your first question, but I just thought I'd let you know there are a lot of people measuring, and there's a lot of high-tech stuff that can be used, and we don't have the measurements done yet.
Yeah, I was wondering, I read that this process also causes earthquakes, and what's the relationship between an earthquake and a sealed well?
It is now, in my opinion, scientifically verified that some of the earthquakes that have occurred in places like Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Ohio, northeastern British Columbia, and England were caused not by fracking, but by the injection of fracking fluid into what are called waste injection wells. A waste injection well is exactly what it sounds like. A well is drilled, or an old well that's no longer being used, is used to produce oil or gas, is now used as a waste dump. The principle is what used to be down there and came up, we just dump it back down. So this is an idea that's been around for 50 or 60 years. It's regulated by the EPA. Problem is, if you start dumping a lot of this waste fluid down an injection well and you haven't done proper inspection to determine whether that well intersects a fault, You're injecting that fluid under pressure. And that pressurized fluid can lubricate the fault or change the pressure on the fault, which can cause the fault to slip, which is the definition of an earthquake. So that's accepted. That's what happened in Ohio. It's what happened in Oklahoma. Ohio had a magnitude 4 earthquake, Oklahoma had a 5.7, which caused extensive damage on the surface. Dallas, Texas had 3.4s, northeastern British Columbia had 3s. Northeastern British Columbia, the government, and in England, the government have determined that their earthquakes were caused by fracking. Not by waste injection, but by fracking itself. And to get to the answer to your question, in both cases, in England and in northeastern British Columbia, they determined that although the earthquake magnitude was relatively small, on the order of magnitude 3, which does not do any substantial damage on the surface, in both cases, those earthquakes had damaged the wells. In northeastern British Columbia, some of the wells were literally sheared. The wells failed. That's not good. So, lots of active research going on right now to try to answer the question, what will be the largest earthquakes we can anticipate from waste injection? Can they be higher than 5.3, 5.7? And as we frack more and more areas more extensively, are we conditioning the rock masses for larger and larger earthquakes and fracking? Big unknown. Don't know. Who hasn't asked the question?
Are there any other options to the well waste? What they're going to be doing with other than injecting back into the ground?
There are 5 things that can be done with flowback waste. 4 of them legal. Let's get rid of Ohio. You wait for a dark, rainy night, and you go to a storm drain, and you open the valve in the back of the truck and just dump it down the storm drain. Those are illegal. Don't expect that to happen very much. So let's talk about the 4 legal methods. 1 is waste injection, one I just told you about. Okay. 2 is disposal through sewage treatment plants. Not a good idea because this isn't sewage. Sewage treatment plants are designed to handle human waste, kitchen waste, organic waste. They're not designed to treat the waste that's coming back from oil and gas wells. Not a good idea. It's now discouraged in Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania did not by regulation prohibit it. They just wrote a letter to all the operators asking them to not do it anymore. Our proposed regulations in New York, those of you who read them, New York State would permit disposal through sewage treatment plants if the sewage treatment plant could prove that it had been modified to correctly treat the waste from oil and gas. Personally, I don't think that's right because sewage plants in general are publicly owned, meaning our taxpayers, we taxpayers pay for them. So why are we, the taxpayers, paying for waste disposal from a profit-making enterprise? It's their waste. They figure out what to do with it. Other 2 methods. Industrial waste treatment. Many industries currently create waste. Paint factories, car factories, toaster factories, gasoline stations, automobile repair shops, they all create waste. What do they do with it? They take it to industrial waste treatment plants which have been designed to treat that kind of waste. Last method, recycling and reuse. Flowback comes up, you capture it. To reuse it, but you can't reuse it as it is. You started with more or less fresh water, you added chemicals, you pumped it down, you fracked the well. What comes back up is not what went down. What comes back up is stuff that's salts, heavy metals. So you got to figure out what to do with that stuff that you captured, so you treat it. And there are various techniques, physical and chemical techniques for treating what comes back up, diluting it with more fresh water, and then re-injecting it in the next well. That's good. It should be a regulatory requirement every place in the United States. If you're going to frack a well, you have to recycle the fluid. Those are the things that can be done.
That's not being done in connection with the expansion of the wells.
There is substantial recycling and reuse being done by some of the 65 to 70 operators in Pennsylvania. Some of them are claiming they're recycling over 90% of their fluid waste, but be careful. wool over eyes. They're recycling their flowback fluid. They're not recycling their produced water or their brine. In other words, it's one thing to recapture the stuff that comes back up in the first week or two. It's another thing to stick around and capture and recycle the stuff that comes up in the next year or two. How much time do we have? Huh? We got to get out of here? We'll meet out in the parking lot. Thank you for all the great questions.